It is my pleasure to be your host as we explore the topic of education and employment in Australia using conflict theory. In these interconnected areas, one of the things that we face in today's world is the conditions of education and employment in Australia. And we are going to explore this by using the conflict theory to analyze these problems, and at the end of this presentation you'll be able to understand how social intuitions and power relations determine educational and employment opportunities in Australia. Australia overall has a really good education system for both private and public tuitions are available in the country, trying to be accommodating to all socioeconomic backgrounds. However, large gaps are still present in these fields of education and learning. The employment situation is complex, and the common issues that are a struggle for people in Australia include lack of skills match, underemployment, and this was shown in the latest statistics from the Australian Bureau that reveals overall unemployment is low, but the youth employment and underemployment are still an issue to this day. These problems are not randomly distributed across the population, which raises questions about structural racism and sexism. For this reason, it is important to understand the context in which education and employment intersect in Australia's education and employment. We are focusing on the issues of disparities that continue to affect education and employment in Australia. The education system in the country is quite developed compared to other countries. However, learners from poor families have always performed worse than their counterparts from well-off families. This educational disparity is reflected into employment difficulties, where learners from disadvantaged schools are likely to experience higher level of unemployment and less education to meet their employment needs. This issue has also created a cycle as lack of proper education creates social inequality, and this in turn influences the educational process of the next generation. The cycle of disadvantage is a major concern to the policymakers and educators and employees. The problem of educational and employment discrimination in Australia is systemic in nature. Socioeconomic differentiation implies that some schools are more resourced than others, which in result schools provide more education and different education. The problem is that the barrier, like poverty and lack of access to early childcare education, is a disadvantaged area to set the tone from the very beginning. These problems are further worse by intergenerational disadvantage, which keeps families entrenched in poverty. The consequences of far-reaching social inequality continues, and the economy loses potential human capital, and the social cohesion is at risk, as the opportunities are not well distributed. These factors give rise to interdependent issues that we call for equally intricate approach. The conflict theory, which originated from Karl Marx, proposes that the society is constantly in conflict because of all the competition for scarce resources. According to this theory, education and employment systems operate to protect the interests of dominant groups. It highlights that education and employment opportunities can precipitate the social injustices instead of eradicating them. For this reason, this perspective is very important in understanding the nature of the disparities that persist in Australian education and employment. In this case, conflict theory will help the researcher to establish the power relations and the structural factors that explain these problems. Conflict theory has several concepts which are as follows. Class struggle means that the conflict between the class owners, the bourgeoisie, and the class of non-owners, the proletariat, in education and employment. This manifests as a lack of equality in provision and access to quality education and employment opportunities. Hegemonic forces are at work here as those who are in power continue to design educational policies and employment practices that benefit them. Conflict theory is a social reproduction theory, which helps how schools and other institutions reproduce their social classes and inequalities in society. These concepts offer a lens through which, in a way, educational and employment systems can reproduce and intensify social inequalities that can be comprehended within the society. The conflict theory analysis of Australian education shows us there are many problems. It is important to note that the existence of private and public schools reflects and reinforces social stratification. Private schools, usually associated with students of high economic status, possess better resources and thus record better results. NAPLAN is a perfect example as an assessment tool aimed at determining the progress in education, may further perpetuate inequalities due to the correlation of school financing to performance, which may be detrimental to schools in economically less privileged regions. The system has the effect of reinforcing the existing social order and is hence not an effective equalizer. The conflict theory perspective emphasizes how these educational structures can help perpetuate the societal power relations. In the employment sector, conflict theory assists in explaining the persistent unfairness that is a clear pattern of unemployment segmentation, where some populations are predominantly assigned positions with low wages and job insecurity. This brings out the credentialism, where the ability to secure formal education qualifications hinder from deserving candidates who cannot afford the same. This is especially felt by those who are socially, economically, and culturally disadvantaged in accessing tertiary education. It is common for people-power relations in the workplace to mirror power relations in the rest of society, which means that management and its practices may perpetuate the existing power imbalances. These factors lead to an environment in which access to employment and career advancement is not equal and thus reproduces social and economic injustice. The strength of using conflict theory to analyse the education and employment in Australia is that it draws attention to structural injustices and power relations. It offers a theoretical perspective on how education and work organisations can maintain social inequality. However, it's not necessary to point out its limitations. Conflict theory may give a distorted picture of social realizations and may not fully consider free will. It is possible that analysing these issues from a standpoint of functionalism or symbolic interactionism can provide different perspectives, using multiple theoretical perspectives which probably have a broader perspective of phenomena under the study. Thus, critical evaluation of conflict theory can better understand Australia's education and employment issues. Conflict theory provides a powerful view on the analysis of education and unemployment issues in Australia. They illustrate how these systems can reinforce rather than disrupt the power dynamics regarding social justice. Thus, the policy implications are as follows: establishing particular strategies to break vicious cycles of disadvantaged groups, enhancing school funding in disadvantaged areas and promoting access to higher education and quality employment for socially excluded groups. Subsequent studies could examine how different disadvantage types interact on equity-based interventions, work, and learning and work environments. Challenges such as these can be migrated into Australia to ensure that the country tries to build a society that provides equal opportunities in education and employment.